Picture this. You're 17 in Athens, around 430 BCE, and the smell of olive oil and sweat hangs thick in the gymnasium. Sunlight cutting in sharp white bars across the dust, and everyone around you is talking about who loves whom, like it's the most normal gossip in the world. And here's something your textbook never told you. Most of us were taught that queer life is somehow modern, like it was invented in the last 50 years with rainbows and parades, and that ancient people were all straight until very recently. They're wrong. And the proof is literally carved into stone, painted on pottery, and written on papyrus that survived for 3,000 years. Look, if you asked your high school history teacher about queer people in ancient civilizations, you'd probably get one paragraph, maybe 2 sentences about Sappho on the island of Lesbos, and then a quick jump to, and the Greeks were a bit weird about it. It's the same paragraph you got, I promise. But the actual record, it's way messier, way more human, and way more interesting than that. Because ancient people didn't have words like gay or straight or bisexual or transgender, not in the way we use them in 2026. And that changes everything about how they lived, loved, and understood desire. Here's the thing we have to get straight before we dive in, no pun intended. When historians look at a love poem from 600 BCE or tomb painting from 2400 BCE, they can't just slap a modern label on it and call it a day. Think about that. If a Roman emperor writes a passionate elegy to his male lover, is he gay? If an Egyptian woman takes a wife in a legal contract, is she a lesbian? If a Mesopotamian priestess lives as both man and woman, is she trans? The answer is kind of yes and kind of no. And honestly, that complication is where all the good stuff lives. So let's go to the beginning, to a place where the river smells like mud and reeds after the flood. Around 1800 BCE in ancient Mesopotamia, in the city of Uruk, where the light is flat and yellow over baked brick walls. There's a text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest story we have, copied onto clay tablets in cuneiform. And at its heart is Gilgamesh, the king, and Enkidu, the wild man made by the gods to be his equal. And the language used to describe them? It's not buddy language. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh wails, tears his hair, drapes himself over the body for 7 days and 7 nights until maggots start to fall from Enkidu's nose, refusing to let go. The Akkadian word they use is tapu, which means companion, but also beloved, also spouse. Scholars debate exactly how to read it, and that's the honest part. But the intensity is unmistakable. And it's not just them. In that same Mesopotamian world, around 1700 BCE, there were people called the Gala, priests of the goddess Inanna, who you might have heard called Ishtar. And the Gala are fascinating because they don't fit any modern box. The Sumerian hymns describe them with a voice like a lamentation singer, wearing women's clothing, their heads shaved, their bodies perfumed with cedar oil, chanting in a dialect called Emesal that was otherwise used only by women. One text from the city of Ur, dated to about 2000 BCE, lists them right alongside other temple officials, paid in barley rations, 30 sila a day, fully integrated, not hidden at all. Inanna herself is described in one hymn as being able to turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man, and the sound of the drum and the reed pipe during her festivals would have echoed off the temple courtyard at dusk. Were the Gala what we'd call trans or non-binary today? Some scholars say yes. Others say it's more accurate to call them a third gender that only made sense in that religious context. Either way, they existed, they were respected,
and nobody tried to erase them until much, much later. Now jump south to Egypt, where the desert air is so dry it cracks your lips, and the Nile smells green and fertile every August when it floods. Around 2400 BCE, in the necropolis at Saqqara. There's a tomb there, and it's not for a pharaoh, it's for two men, Khnum and Khnumhotep, both royal manicurists to King Niuserre of the 5th dynasty. And the painting inside? It shows them nose to nose, the most intimate pose in Egyptian art, the same pose used for married couples, their children maybe, or heirs, standing at their feet, the colors still vivid after 4,400 years, ochre and turquoise and gold. Their names are intertwined in a way that Egyptologists like Greg Reeder have pointed out is usually reserved for husband and wife.
Now, are we absolutely sure they were lovers? No, and a good historian will tell you we can't be 100% certain. Maybe they were brothers, maybe twins. The record is thin for non-royal people. But the way they chose to be depicted, for eternity, in the most expensive thing they'd ever commission, tells you what they wanted people to see. And that desire to be seen together forever hits different when you stand in that cramped, hot tomb and hear the echo of your own breath. And speaking of Egypt, there's a papyrus that flips the whole story again. The Turin Erotic Papyrus from around 1150 BCE, found at Deir el-Medina, the village of the tomb builders. It's about 12 feet long when unrolled, painted on thin, rustling papyrus that smells faintly of old dust, and it shows all kinds of intimate scenes, men with women, women with women, men with men, with a frankness that would make a Victorian blush. No shame. No hiding, just bodies drawn with humor and exaggeration, alongside a satirical text. It was probably not temple art, probably more like a bachelor party scroll, or a bit of ancient humor. But the point is, nobody was burning it. It was rolled up and kept. Someone thought it was worth keeping. Okay, so Greece, where everyone was some kind of gay, right? Well, actually, no. And this is where it gets both interesting and uncomfortable, so we need to be careful. It's about 338 BCE. The dust is choking at the Battle of Chaeronea, the sound of 30,000 Macedonian sarissas clacking like a forest of spears, and an entire unit of Theban soldiers is wiped out to the last man. They were called the Sacred Band of Thebes. 150 pairs of male lovers, 300 men total. And the idea, written down by Plutarch about 400 years later, was that lovers would never abandon each other on the battlefield out of shame and love. And they didn't. They died where they stood. Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, reportedly wept when he saw their bodies intertwined. It's a powerful story, and it was real. But here's the complication your textbook skips. In Athens around 500 to 400 BCE, the dominant form of same-sex relationship that we have the most pottery and poetry about involved an older man, usually in his 20s, and a younger youth in his mid to late teens. And modern scholars rightly find this troubling. We can't talk about it without naming that. The Athenians themselves had rules, strict social scripts about who could do what, who was supposed to be active, who was supposed to be passive, and it was all tangled up with status, citizenship, and power, not just attraction. An adult male citizen loving another adult male citizen as an equal, that was actually kind of scandalous in Athens. It messed with their hierarchy. The poet Sappho, writing around 600 BCE on Lesbos, where the sea wind smells like salt and lemons and the light is blinding white on the harbor, gives us something completely different. Fragments of poems on papyrus scraps about women loving women, about the moon has set and the Pleiades,
about a woman named Athis and another named Anactoria, with a tenderness that feels startlingly modern. But even Sappho's world wasn't a free love utopia. She was writing within a specific circle of women, probably involved in ritual and education, and we only have about 650 surviving fragments out of what was once 9 books. So much is lost. Rome takes that Greek inheritance and does something very Roman with it, which is to make it about power.
It's a Tuesday afternoon in Rome, around 130 CE. The marble of the baths of Trajan is warm under your bare feet, steam hissing, the sound of water splashing and men laughing, and the Emperor Hadrian is walking with a young man from Bithynia named Antinous, maybe 19 years old, dark curls, famous for his beauty. Hadrian, who was 54 at the time, was famously devoted to him, and when Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 CE under mysterious circumstances, Hadrian didn't just mourn, he deified him. He founded a city, Antinopolis, with 3,000 settlers, struck coins with Antinous's face, had over 2,000 statues carved, more than survive of many emperors, and declared him a god. You can still see those statues today in museums, the cool white marble, the eyes looking slightly down, that soft, melancholic expression. It was grief made into empire-wide religion. And yet, Roman law was weirdly contradictory. A Roman citizen man could have sex with male slaves, with non-citizens, with younger men, and it was seen as asserting dominance. But to be seen as the passive partner, especially as an adult citizen, was a slur. It could end your political career. The poet Catullus, writing around 50 BCE, savages his rivals with poems about this exact anxiety, his ink sharp and vicious on wax tablets. So Rome wasn't tolerant in our sense. It was hierarchical. Desire was everywhere, but equality wasn't. Now let's sail further, because this story isn't just Mediterranean, and that's part of what got erased. In what is now the American Southwest, around 1200 CE, in Zuni Pueblo, where the adobe smells like sun-baked earth and chili roasting in late afternoon, there were people the Zuni called Lamana. The most famous, Wewa, born in 1849, lived as a Lamana, a person who embodied both masculine and feminine roles, weaving, potting, dancing in both men's and women's ceremonies. In 1886, Wewa traveled to Washington, D.C. as a cultural ambassador, met President Grover Cleveland, shook his hand in the White House, wearing a woven dress and jewelry that jingled softly, and was so respected as a craftsperson that anthropologists like Matilda Cox Stevenson wrote about Wewa's weaving for the Smithsonian. The sound of the loom, the texture of the wool, the precision of the pattern, all of it was Wewa's art. And the Zuni weren't alone. Over 150 indigenous nations in North America had similar roles. The Lakota, Winkte, the Navajo, Nadlehi, each with their own language, their own spiritual duties, not just about who you loved, but who you were in the community. A bridge, a healer, a keeper of stories. And honestly, this is where the erasure hits hardest. Because think about India, around 300 CE, in the Kama Sutra, which most people in America think is just a sex manual, but is actually a 1,250-verse guide to living, written by Vatsyayana in Sanskrit on palm leaves that smell like oil and smoke. It has an entire chapter on third-gender people, called Tritiya Prakriti, describing their lives, their relationships, their work as masseuses and courtesans and attendants, with a matter-of-fact tone, no condemnation. And the temples at Khajuraho, built between 950 and 1050 CE, where the sandstone is warm to the touch even at dawn, have friezes with hundreds of figures,
Couples of all combinations, men with men, women with women, alone, together, in groups, carved right next to scenes of war and music and prayer, as if to say, this is all part of life.
The Devadasi women, temple dancers dedicated to the gods, lived outside conventional marriage, controlling their own property and sexuality for over 1,000 years, their anklets ringing on stone floors. None of this was hidden until it was, and we haven't even touched China, where for over 2,000 years, from the Han Dynasty around 200 BCE through the Qing, there was a whole tradition of male love called the Passion of the Cut Sleeve. The story comes from Emperor Ai of Han, who in 1 BCE cut off his own sleeve rather than wake his lover, Dong Xian, who had fallen asleep on it, the silk making a soft tearing sound in the quiet palace. For centuries, Chinese scholars wrote about male lovers among emperors and officials without panic. 11 out of 25 Han emperors had well-documented male favorites, their names listed right in the official histories, the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian. It wasn't until much later that this was reframed as shameful. So why don't you know this? Why did you get one paragraph about Sappho and nothing about the Gala or the Lamana or the Tritiya Prakriti? Here's the pattern that emerges when you line all these cases up side by side. Every single one of these cultures had its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own limits. None of them were a perfect, queer paradise. And that's important. We shouldn't romanticize them. But they all had space, language, and often respect for lives and loves that didn't fit a simple, straight box. And then, pretty consistently, that space got closed, not by the people themselves, but by later empires, especially colonial Christianity, Victorian moralists, and 19th century nationalists who went back and literally rewrote, recarved, or just ignored the evidence. British colonial officials in India in the 1860s, for example, criminalized same-sex intimacy with Section 377, calling the Khajuraho carvings obscene and forcing Devadasi women into poverty, their temple bells silenced. American missionaries and government agents in the 1880s and 1890s banned indigenous ceremonies and forced Lamana and Winkta children into boarding schools, cutting their hair, dressing them in wool uniforms that itched, punishing them for speaking their language. Victorian translators in England took Sappho's passionate poems about women and added the word brother in brackets where no brother existed, or translated wife as friend, the scratch of their pen, literally straightwashing history. And even in Europe, the Christian Church, after about 400 CE, started to recode Roman and Greek practices as sinful, turning what had been a matter of status into a matter of soul. The smell of incense replacing the smell of bathhouse steam. The wild part is often the actual historical record. It's more honest than the cover-up. When you read the real sources, the clay tablet, the tomb wall, the palm leaf, the census record from Antinopolis, you hear real people, not symbols. You hear Gilgamesh refusing to leave a body. You hear Sappho saying, "Someone will remember us." You hear Hadrian naming a city after grief. You hear Weiwa's loom clicking. And you realize the erasure wasn't an accident. It was a project. And it worked so well that most of us grew up thinking we were the first. If this rewired anything in how you think about the past, hit follow. The archive has a lot more like it. And down in the comments, tell me which of these histories you wish they'd actually taught you in school.